reason that there are multiple types of stakeholders that we can try and look at in the context of a primary, secondary, and obviously we'll have a look at some of these other things as well. So primary stakeholders are people or groups that are directly impacted by the actions or the efforts or the outcomes of what we're trying to do as a project, a product development, or a process re-engineering or a process improvement initiative that we're working on, the change initiative, for example. All of these programs, all of these kind of initiatives, they could potentially, directly impact a certain group of stakeholders, and those would be the primary stakeholders. And again, when we talk about impacting, it could be both positive and negative ways. It's not necessarily one way or the other. So they could be potentially impacted by this program in any way possible, but then that is going to be direct impact, and that's why we call these people or the set of stakeholders as primary. So for example, the customers who are using a product, for example, for the last 20 years in the pharma industry, or for example, the life sciences, they could potentially be, sometimes it could be the patients who are going to use the drug. They're the primary stakeholders, because of all of your drug development efforts would lead in creating a particular drug or a medicine that would be consumed by the patients who are in the hospitals. Those would be the primary stakeholders. But then sometimes you may not have the access, or you're not really engaging with them on a day-to-day basis. It's more the other people that you would. So irrespective of that, the direct impact of your initiative, of your drug development, is going to be the patient. So in that case, they're going to be a primary stakeholder. And when it comes to this finance industry, for example, when you talk about the banks, it's the account holders, the final account holders and the customers of the bank. They would be the key stakeholders, the primary stakeholders, when you're trying to launch, for example, a mobile application, so that they can directly check on their mobile phone the current portfolio of and the net worth, the current net worth, the set of accounts they have, the portfolio, the transactions, the ledgers, and finally the value of their the transactions into their accounts. All of these could actually be looked at within one mobile app. So in that sense, these customers who are the account holders within the bank would be the primary stakeholders in that case. So sometimes primary stakeholders on both sides of the equation. That is important, because it is not necessary that you've got only one side of the coin. You always need to look at the other side of the coin as well. So that's why we need to be conscious of the aspect of the potential negative impact that could have on the other person. If it is really be positive, as I say, one man's food is another man's poison. Sometimes it could benefit one stakeholder, while on the other it could be detrimental, and it could be very harmful for the other stakeholder. For example, the case in this point is in the context of the previous example I was telling about the shopping complex, or even the apartment building that you plan to build newly with. It's a huge tower that you want to build in the existing neighborhood. So one of the things could be that you've got people who are moving into who've got one bedroom, for example, or who do not have their own flat at the moment, who don't have their own house. For the first time buyers, that could be a big boon, because they could actually move in. They can get into this again. People who are in the early stage, the first time house buyers could be a huge benefit for them if you have got this apartment complex being built here in this neighborhood. But then when you talk about on the other side of the coin, as I say, it would be really difficult for the people who have already got those who've been there for quite some time, about 20, 30 years, and who would like to live a peaceful life, perhaps some kind of retirees, for example, and they wouldn't want this huge influx of population with 100, for example, 180 houses being built in one tower, and you've got 5 towers like that. It would bring in huge traffic onto the streets, and perhaps those people might actually feel the heat of the increased traffic due to the new one. So you've got to kind of understand both sides of the coin. Who some of the stakeholders would actually get huge benefit, whereas the other stakeholders might actually be getting a bit of a hurt because of this new development. So very important. Again, in the context of the rent control, for example, if the government introduces a new rent control policy or regulation to kind of help the tenants to make sure that they can't be evicted. You can't just kick out a tenant just like that, and then you need to have the contract in place, and you need to follow the contract and to the letter and the spirit, and then there needs to be no deposit. You should not charge them deposit, huge deposits, and you can only perhaps charge them 1 month rent in advance or something like that. If you have got those rules in place and the law is passed, then obviously the tenants would be really happy because they don't have to shell out 5 months or 10 months of rent as advance, which is actually a huge thing for them, huge relief for them, because they don't have to really shell out all that money upfront. And then also the fact that you can't evict a tenant even if they fail. I'm not saying I'm not an expert in this rent control policy or this law, but I'm just giving an example that perhaps if there's a law or a rule that says the clause could actually say that you cannot evict a tenant even if they do not pay the rent for 3 months or 6 months, then potentially that would mean that some people who can still afford to pay might actually take advantage of that and not pay the rent, and still they're enjoying their stay, whereas the landlord, that could potentially put them in a fix because they're not getting the money, they're not getting the regular income from the tenants. And so this kind of rent control policy changes would actually be upsetting for them, would be harming their interests, the landlord's interests, whereas for the tenants it's going to be really helpful. So we as business analysts need to look at all sides, and then be able to understand the concerns and the pain areas and the opportunities, the problems, and
Boss,
the needs of all parties involved.
how is this rent thing to do with business analyst? How is that? Maybe I'm missing something.
Business analyst, you might actually have something to do with this, right? As a say rent control policy, they're just giving an example of a policy that has been either changed or introduced by the government as a rule. So business analysts are there in every industry, right? Why not we have a business analyst in real estate, or a business analyst in
Aha,
policy, in
okay.
government, right? So we as business analysts need to understand all sides. That's what I'm trying to say, and this is an example that
Ah,
they've given. So when you go and when you try and start a new project, for example, any new project or initiative, you would drop the plan, and you need to first identify all the stakeholders, understand their needs, their concerns, and then write a document, write a detailed requirement and a proposal for the on behalf of the customer or on behalf of the client, saying that we are planning to build this new flat and apartment building complex into this. So what are the pros and cons? Who are the stakeholders? What are their concerns? So you need to go there as be a business analysis professional. You need to go there and do the initial interaction. You talk to the people, talk to the neighborhood community, talk to the shopkeepers in the area, talk to the traffic control wardens, understand what are the traffic regulations, traffic violations happening now at the moment. Look at the crime rate. Look at the kind of shoplifting and things like that. What kind of crimes being committed? All of these need to be reported, right? So when we try and propose a project, same thing anyway, whether it is a real estate or a banking industry or a healthcare, we as BAs need to be on the forefront of all these different types of initiatives. Irrespective of that, we need to understand the concerns of the stakeholders. We need to identify the stakeholders. We need to create a RACI matrix, right? The responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. That matrix. We need to create the matrix. We need to be interacting with the stakeholders if required. We need to talk to them. We need to interview them. We need to get them into a meeting room. We need to understand their concerns. We need to understand if they're happy or not. What are the kind of their objections for the proposal? Why do they think that this is not a good idea? What are the strong themes coming in from them? What are the contrasting, conflicting views expressed by the stakeholders? And then be able to document these. And perhaps if we have the right wherewithal, we can even negotiate with the right stakeholders to actually bring them to a consensus. Perhaps run a workshop, and then get the whole thing done. And then once we have the business case created, then once the business case is approved, then we go ahead, start the project. Then again, we go to the stakeholders and the users, get the requirement, the customers, and get the requirements. So again, we do this, right? That's what we as BAs need to do on a day-to-day basis. So irrespective of the industry, the domain, and what you do, that's the reason why we are discussing this, right? The importance of stakeholder engagement, stakeholder management is very, very critical for the BAs to do. So irrespective of any industry that you talk about, it's really, and that's what is the greatest strength of a BA. So you can actually get exposure, get to interact with the people, not just within your own team, but within the senior management, with the CXOs, and also across these different teams. And then you also get exposure to the outside stakeholders, to external stakeholders. You get to have meetings with the regulators. You get to have meetings with the suppliers, with the customers, with the users, understand what they've got to say about this, understand their requirements, understand their side of their version of the story, and then being able to bring it inside, and then compare and contrast and see what are the differences, where are the contrasts and conflicts happening there, right? So all of this is part of BA's job, and that's where I think BAs are very, very, very fortunate to that they get to work across different levels, and not just within the organization but also outside as well. So we need to
Okay.
be, yeah, we need to be in that position to elicit these things. The secondary stock, so the policy, I mean, we were discussing the policy and the kind of things on the ground, but what I'm saying is in terms of the owner, the landlord and the owner, they would have some issues to deal with, in terms, if your rent control policy is too lenient with the tenants, because that's what it's supposed to do, right? So it is giving power to the tenants, which is what it is supposed to do. But then if it is giving power to the tenants, which means that you're actually taking the power out of the owner's hands, and the landlord's control. So obviously they would be unhappy with some of the things if you're being too lenient with the tenants and how they deal with the tenants. So it's the two sides of the coin, as I say. So we need to be understanding that side of things as well. That's what I was just giving an example of that. So moving on to the secondary stakeholders. So these are the people, groups that are indirectly impacted by the actions or efforts or the outcomes of what we're trying to do, again, in a positive or a negative way. So in a sense, they're not really directly as much impact as that of the primary stakeholders, but they do have some impact that they are going to receive, and that too, it's indirectly, it's not directly being caused or being impacted by our solution or offering that we're working on. It's rather indirect way. And an example on this one could be to, as I think this is an example which you can try and relate to, but I'm not sure if it is a right one, but just trying to have a look at it. So it's a program to decrease domestic violence. It will have a positive impact on the emergency room personnel, because the number of cases will be reduced. Because if you really talk about the new law that you're going to introduce in terms of the domestic violence, or the on child abuse or anything like that, you can try and bring in some law regulation. Then hopefully, I mean, again, in reality it might be different, but in theory you are trying to actually bring in more awareness, more education, more and more stipulation and implementation of that. So that means that you're actually telling the children, telling the women at home to kind of make them more aware of this. And in a sense, the other people also would get more and more educated and aware of the negative implications of the abuse. So they should be rather more conscious of this, and they're not doing it consciously, which means that they're not many cases would be reported. But if that is the case, then which means that if there are not many cases being reported, then that means that there are less and less of personnel who should be attending to the emergencies, whether it's a call center or it's in the control room, as what we call in the police parlance. You don't have to have so many experts who would need to attend to these calls, because you expect them to be reduced. But then, which actually means that more and more training is required for police to be able to handle such a situation, because not just police. The training also need to be given to the people at large, which means in the schools, in the colleges, in the primary schools, secondary academies. People need to be made aware of what is domestic violence all about, why does that happen, how can they either react to that or kind of take it to that, how should they respond to this, what are the options available for them. So all of these training sessions or knowledge sharing, knowledge transfer, awareness sessions need to be given, meaning more and more training, more and more cost and effort need to be on that front. So it's a it's a double-edged sword. But then what is important is that this is actually a secondary stakeholder here, because you're not really looking at directly impact of this, because there's the training and training people, getting people who can train, who can create the content, who can create the advertising, who can create the promotion, who can create this kind of syllabus within the schools. So again, these people, these are the ones who would need to be working on this one. And again, that's not directly, they're not going to be directly impacted by this Domestic Violence Act, because they don't have anything to do that with that. But it's going to be indirectly either helping them or giving more work, or making them stressed out more because they've got to do a lot of paperwork, blah blah blah, because of a change in the act. So it's an indirect impact. So they become, in this case, as secondary stakeholders. And that's why, it's just as an example to say that when you try and introduce something as a policy change, or as a law, or anything, if you want to introduce a new product into the market, sometimes it's when you try and introduce, for example, a new version of iPad, or any tablet of this kind, you could potentially increase the sales of glasses, and you could increase the sales of the eye tests. Why? Because most of the children would be getting to use the technology, the devices, and the screen time would increase. And that could contribute to, for example, their problems within the eyesight. And that would increase the cases of the significant increase in the problems of children between, let's say, 6 and 15 years old, students or children. And they would be required to go to the tests and get glasses and prescription glasses and all this to help address the sight problem. So which means it's an indirect, even though it is direct, they're not really the end customers. We're not talking about the Specsavers and the Vision Expresses of the world when you're trying to introduce an iPad. But now it has an indirect impact with respect to that. Whether it's positive or negative, that's a different context. But we need to also be aware of all these potential scenarios that could come through. The other aspect of the key stakeholders, we've had a look at primary stakeholders, which means those are the stakeholders that have got a direct impact with your outcome and of the effort, or the outcome from the initiative. And then the secondary stakeholders are the ones who have got an indirect impact from your initiative and outcome. And then the key stakeholders basically is a term that is used to recognize the members of a subgroup of stakeholders who have power to significantly change or damage a project and become reason for its success or failure. Which means these are the people who hold the key for your project. They hold the budget. They're the people who can actually decide which way, which direction your project is going to take. They can actually pull the triggers. They can actually kind of pull the strings and make your project stop, make your initiative stop. They could actually kind of say that, hey, you're not going to go any further. So essentially, these are the people who hold the the budgets, who are the sponsors, apparently the sponsor of the project, or who are the people who could actually take a key decision about the direction which the project is moving. So very important that we need to be considerate of this, because they're not direct, they're not either directly or indirectly impacted with this project in the sense of usage of your product. They're not going to be your customers, your users, but then they're going to actually kind of call the shots in terms of whether the project is continuing or not, or whether it is getting more budget, more funds in the next year, things like that. So very, very important. And that's, for example, the directors and the managing directors, the marketing directors, and the CXOs, the CIOs, CTOs, CFO, CMO, all of these different types of the CXOs could be the key stakeholders when it comes to your the initiative or the program that we're working on. So it's very important we identify these. Again, going back to the power interest grid that we have had a look at before. The power interest grid actually gives you that who has got the significant power and what kind of interest they have on your initiative. So very important to actually kind of identify these and then be able to engage them more and then continuously update them with the project and keep them engaged about what's happening on your project, what's really coming out in the next sprint, blah blah blah. Keep them really happy, keep them on your side, keep them engaged with the progress of the project on a day-to-day basis.